You know how sometimes life doesn't fall apart in a storm, but in silence, not with shouting, not with slammed doors, but with the sound of paper sliding across a table. That's how it began for me. The Whitman Diner had been standing on Main Street for as long as I could remember. Not fancy, not polished, just ours. Red vinyl booths patched with tape, a jukebox in the corner that hadn't worked in 10 years, but nobody had the heart to throw out and coffee so strong it could wake the dead. My late husband Frank built that place with his own hands, and me, I kept it alive. Morning shifts, late nights, through sickness, through grief. Folks around town used to say, if the neon sign's on Rachel's inside, that was the truth. But that Sunday evening, it wasn't pie and laughter on the table. It was betrayal. My son Noah, always the sharp one, always the one who thought he was born for bigger things, sat across from me with a manila folder. He pushed it toward me like it was nothing more than a receipt. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed. "Mom," he said, "it's time. You can't keep running this place forever. We've put together a transition plan. All you need to do is sign." I looked down. Across the first page in bold black letters were the words, "Transition of Ownership Agreement." My daughter Vanessa leaned in before I could even process it. She had that smile she always wore when she wanted something syrupy sweet, almost kind, but sharp underneath, if you knew her like I did. "It's not about pushing you out, Mama," she said. "You'll still be here, greeting the regulars, chatting with the customers, the parts you love. We'll handle the heavy lifting." Heavy lifting. That's what she called frying bacon at 5 a.m. after chemo treatments. That's what she called hauling crates of potatoes when Frank's back went out. That's what she called patching the roof in a thunderstorm when Luke, my youngest, was still too small to hold a hammer steady. And speaking of Luke, he didn't say much at all. Just sat there with his arms folded, looking at me like I was a child who needed correcting. His silence said more than words. "Don't make this harder than it has to be, Mom." I flipped through the pages. At first, it was the usual legal jargon, percentages, authority transfers, signatures. But then my eyes landed on one sentence near the bottom. "I'll never forget it. Rachel Whitman may remain on the premises in a ceremonial role, subject to the discretion of the new management." Ceremonial role, subject to discretion. I felt my throat close. That was their way of telling me I'd gone from owner to mascot, from backbone to burden. I didn't say anything right away. My fingers traced the edge of the paper, but inside, I was somewhere else. I was back in 1983, standing on that same diner floor in the dead of winter, watching Frank roll in the new grill we bought on credit, praying we could make enough pancakes to pay it off. I was back in 1999, holding the ledger with shaking hands after he died, wondering how I was going to keep the doors open alone. I was back in 2012, smiling at truckers while wearing a scarf to hide the chemo hair loss, telling everyone I was fine, because that's what women like me do. And now, my children, my own flesh and blood, were telling me all that sweat, all that sacrifice, all that history was a ceremonial role. Noah leaned back in his chair, confident, tapping his pen like this was just business. "It's the responsible thing, Mom. You'll still get a small stipend. You won't have to worry about bills anymore." Bills. That's what he thought this was about. As if I had kept this place alive for money. Vanessa added softly, almost cooing, "And we've already talked to a developer. They want to turn the diner into a branded franchise. Just imagine new booths, better signage, more customers. You won't have to work yourself to death." I wanted to laugh. Work myself to death. Work was the only thing that had kept me alive after Frank passed. Work was the reason I got out of bed every morning when grief pressed down on me like a stone. Work was the rhythm of my life. I turned my gaze to Luke, hoping for something, some flicker of the boy who used to sit on the counter eating pie scraps, some hint of loyalty. But he just looked away. The silence grew heavy. Even Vanessa's smile began to twitch. Finally, I picked up the pen. Not to sign, but to click it once, twice, 3 times. Then I set it down. "I see," I said quietly. "So this is what it comes to." Noah exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound halfway between relief and annoyance. "There's no need to drag this out, Mom. It's just business." Business. That word cut sharper than a knife. My life's work, my marriage, my memories boiled down to a spreadsheet. I pushed the folder back toward him. "I won't sign." The room went cold. Noah's jaw tightened. Vanessa's hand froze on the table. Luke finally spoke, his voice low and hard. "You'll lose everything if you don't." For a second, I thought I might cry, but I didn't. I stood up slowly, my knees stiff but steady. "You've made your position clear," I told them. "Now let me make mine." I walked out of the dining room without looking back. The papers stayed on the table. So did my children. On the porch, the November wind cut sharp across my face. My coffee mug sat abandoned on the rail, cold as stone. I gripped it anyway, like it could keep me grounded. Out across the street, the diner's neon sign flickered weakly, half lit, half broken, same as me. For the first time in my life, I realized love might not be enough. Not when greed and entitlement sit at your own table. I'd faced enemies before landlords who tried to hike our rent health inspectors, who thought a widow couldn't keep a kitchen running, even cancer that wanted me 6 feet under. I fought them all. But nothing in my life had prepared me for the day my children looked me in the eye and tried to erase me with a pen. They thought I would fold. They thought I was too tired, too sentimental, too old to fight. What they didn't know, what they had forgotten, was that I had built my whole life on not folding. And that night, standing on the porch with the wind rattling the tin roof above me, I felt it rise inside me again. The same fire that kept me going when Frank died. The same fire that got me through nights alone, through grief, through sickness. They thought it was over, but it was just beginning. And friend, that was where it all went wrong. Stick around, because the way this story turns, you're not going to want to miss it. And if you're hearing my words right now, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I'd love to see how far this story travels. You'd be surprised how quiet betrayal sounds once the shouting's over. After that Sunday night, the house was still the same. The walls still smelled of coffee and bacon grease. The old cuckoo clock still chimed on the hour, but something inside me had cracked. I didn't sleep. Not really. I laid in bed listening to the wind rattle the gutters, thinking about those pages left on my dining room table. Ceremonial role, subject to discretion, words that told me my own children thought I was already fading. The next morning, I opened the diner at 6 sharp, just like I always did. The neon sign buzzed and flickered, casting that half-dead glow across Main Street. I wiped down the counter, filled the salt shakers, started the coffee pot. Nothing unusual. But every sound felt sharper, heavier, like the diner itself knew something had shifted. People came in, same as always. Old man Kearns with his newspaper, the high school kids grabbing breakfast sandwiches before class, Pastor Jim with his Bible tucked under his arm. I smiled, poured coffee, listened to their chatter. On the outside, I was fine, but inside, I was counting every face, every person who had ever sat in those booths, wondering if they'd still come, if the place had some chain restaurant sign hanging out front instead of Whitman's Diner. By noon, my kids showed up. Not together. No, they were too smart for that. First Vanessa with her high heels clicking against the tile like she owned the place. Then Noah talking too loud about future plans. Then Luke staying near the door like he couldn't wait to leave. They didn't sit. They didn't order pie. They just looked around like buyers at an open house. I didn't let on. I just kept pouring coffee, kept my head down. But I was listening. I always have been. That week was the longest of my life. Every night after closing, I sat in the back office with a shoebox of old papers. Frank had always been the dreamer, but me, I was the one who filed the deeds, the receipts, the letters from the county clerk. 40 years of paper yellowed at the edges, ink fading, but still legible. I sorted through every page. And then, late Wednesday night, I found it. Folded inside an envelope marked Property Tax 1987 was a letter from the Historical Society. Frank had filed to recognize the diner as a community landmark. It never went fully through. Back then the funding wasn't available, but the paperwork had been logged, stamped, and signed, which meant the option was still there. My hands trembled as I held it. A single sheet of paper, 35 years old, suddenly felt heavier than all the insults and betrayal combined. I slipped it into a clean folder and set it aside. That was the first seed. But seeds don't grow without water. On Thursday, Pastor Jim stopped by after closing. He didn't ask why my hands were shaking or why I hadn't touched my plate of meatloaf. He just sat across from me in the booth and said, "Rachel, I've known you since you were 21. Don't let them tell you you're finished." It was the first time all week I almost cried. Friday morning, I unlocked the diner early and found Clara, the old cook who'd worked with me for years, already inside. She'd been gone a while, off helping her daughter with a newborn. But there she was, flour on her apron sleeves rolled up. "Heard what your kids are trying to do," she said, her voice steady as stone. "You think I'd let them push me out too? Let's get to work." I didn't ask who told her. Small towns have no secrets. Clara didn't just cook. She started pulling out her own stack of records, pay stubs, employment letters, even receipts with the diner's name on them dating back decades. "Paper trails matter," she said. "Don't let them tell you otherwise." That was the second seed. By the weekend, I was exhausted, but my fire was back. Every night, I stayed in the office long after dark, sorting documents, making notes, building a wall of proof. The betrayal still stung, but now it was fuel. I started to see things I'd missed before, the way Noah had asked about tax bills months earlier, how Vanessa suddenly offered to handle the bookkeeping, how Luke asked if the diner's safe was still in the office. It wasn't concern. It had never been concern. It was strategy. Saturday night, as I locked the front door, I caught my reflection in the glass. My face looked older, yes. My hair was grayer than I remembered. But my eyes, they were sharp. The same eyes Frank used to say could see through a storm. I whispered to myself, "You're not done." On Sunday, I sat through church like nothing was wrong. But when the service ended and everyone filed into the fellowship hall, I saw them. My 3 children whispering with a man in a suit I didn't recognize. He had the look of a developer, polished shoes, shiny watch smile that never touched his eyes. I walked right past them, didn't say a word, but inside I was already adding another note to my growing list, because that was the moment I knew they weren't just circling. They were moving. And if I didn't act soon, the diner would be gone before Christmas. So I went home, pulled out that folder with the Historical Society letter, and laid it flat on the table. Next to it, I placed Frank's old tape recorder, the one he used to record community meetings back in the day. I hadn't touched it in years, but it still worked. And I remembered something. One night, in the late 90s, Frank had recorded himself talking about the diner, about keeping it alive for Rachel no matter what. I never knew why he taped it. Maybe just to hear his own thoughts. Maybe because some part of him already knew this day would come. I dug through the old cassettes until I found it. Labeled in his scratchy handwriting, "Diner Legacy." I pressed play. His voice filled the room, steady and strong. "This place belongs to Rachel. Always will. She kept it alive when I couldn't. Don't let anyone tell her otherwise." My breath caught. That was the third seed. I didn't know yet how I'd use it, but I knew this much: the fight was coming. And for the first time all week, I wasn't afraid. That was the week I stopped being silent. That was the week their whispers became my warning. And it was just the beginning. Stick with me, because the way this unfolds, you'll see how one woman they thought was finished, too old, too tired, turned a whole town against their lies. And while you're here, tell me something. Has anyone ever tried to write you off before your story was over? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your truth. Sometimes the moment you've been dreading doesn't arrive with thunder. It comes with the sound of folding chairs scraping across a church hall floor. That's where it happened, our small town fellowship hall, the place that smelled of old hymnals and potluck casseroles. My children thought it would be the perfect stage for their big announcement. Safe, public, respectable. They thought I'd be too embarrassed to fight back in front of neighbors. They were wrong. The room was full that night. Folks I'd poured coffee for since high school, men who'd worked the morning shift with Frank when the diner first opened, women who'd dropped casseroles on my porch when I was sick. They all showed up because my kids told them it was a family business meeting. I sat near the back, quiet. Let them do their show. Noah took the lead, of course. He stood tall, crisp shirt, that banker's voice that made him sound smarter than he really was. Thank you all for coming. As you know, the Whitman Diner has been a cornerstone of our town for decades. But times change. It's time for new leadership, fresh vision. Fresh vision. That's what he called gutting the soul out of a place built on sweat and late nights. Vanessa followed, smile polished, her hand gestures rehearsed like she'd practiced in front of a mirror. We want Mama to finally rest. She deserves it. That's why we've partnered with a development group who will modernize the diner while preserving its charm. Modernize, preserve, fancy words for selling out. Luke stood behind them, silent, arms crossed, the muscle to their mouthpieces. The crowd murmured, shifting in their folding chairs. Some nodded politely. Others looked uneasy. Everyone turned their eyes toward me, sitting small in the back row. I could feel the heat of their gaze, the weight of expectation. That was the moment they thought I'd fold. They thought I'd lower my head, shuffle forward, and smile weakly while they announced my retirement. Instead, I stood. Slowly. My knees ached, but my voice didn't shake. Before you go any further, I said, letting the quiet settle, I have something to share. The room hushed. Even Pastor Jim leaned forward, eyebrows raised. I carried a folder in my hands. Plain, ordinary. But inside, it was everything. I walked down the aisle, each step echoing against the wooden floor. When I reached the front, I didn't face my children. I faced the town. This diner I began holding up the first paper wasn't just a business. It was declared eligible for heritage status in 1987. My late husband filed the paperwork himself. It's been stamped, recorded, and kept in county files all these years. I unfolded the letter, yellowed, but still clear. The stamp of the Historical Society gleamed under the fluorescent light. Gasps spread across the room. I set the letter on the table in front of my children. Vanessa's smile cracked. Noah's jaw tightened. Luke shifted his weight. And that means I continued, this diner cannot be sold, demolished, or converted without the consent of the designated custodian. And that custodian, I tapped the page with my finger, is me. Only me. The crowd rippled with whispers, but I wasn't done. From my purse, I pulled out the old tape recorder, Frank's recorder, the one I hadn't touched in years. I pressed play. The room filled with his voice. Strong, steady, familiar. This place belongs to Rachel. Always will. She kept it alive when I couldn't. Don't let anyone tell her otherwise. Silence followed. Not the comfortable kind. The kind that wraps around a room and squeezes until you can't breathe. I looked each of my children in the eye. Slowly. One by one. You thought I didn't notice? I said softly. The paperwork you slid across my table. The whispers with developers. The clause about mental clarity. You thought I was too tired to fight. too sentimental to see through it. But I've been keeping records my whole life. Every deed, every bill, every scrap of proof that this place is mine. Vanessa's cheeks flushed red. Noah's ears turned scarlet. Luke's arms dropped to his sides. And now I said, my voice low but firm, so has the town. Pastor Jim rose from his chair. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice carrying across the hall. I held up the folder again. Every word, every document, right here. The room erupted. Some people clapped, others muttered under their breath. But one thing was clear, the tide had turned. Noah tried to recover. He cleared his throat, raised his voice. "Mama, let's not be dramatic. We only wanted what's best." I cut him off. Calm, steady. What's best would never come with lies. The mic drop moment had already landed, and everyone knew it. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply gathered my papers, clicked off the recorder, and walked back to my seat. The room's eyes followed me, but I didn't look back at my children. Not once, because in that moment, the fight was no longer mine. The truth had taken over, and they were finished. That night, when I finally closed my front door, I didn't cry. I didn't collapse. I brewed a cup of tea and sat on the porch watching the neon diner sign flicker across the street. It was still broken, half-lit, buzzing like a dying firefly. But I knew one thing for certain, sooner or later it would shine again. Because the Whitman diner wasn't theirs to take. Not now. Not ever. That was the breaking point. The moment the mask slipped. The night the town saw the truth for themselves. And friend, the fallout from that night, it was just beginning. Stick around, because what came next was a reckoning they never saw coming. And while you're here, tell me if you'd been sitting in that church hall, whose side would you have been on? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to know. You'd think that after a night like that, I'd wake up triumphant, victorious. But the truth, I woke up sore tired with coffee grounds stuck under my fingernails. Life doesn't hand you a medal for surviving your own children's betrayal. Still, something had shifted. That Monday morning, I unlocked the diner at 6 sharp. The neon sign flickered like always buzzing against the gray dawn. But when I pushed open the door, I wasn't alone. Clara was already there, flour dust on her apron, rolling out biscuit dough like she had never left. "Heard about last night," she said, without looking up. "Town's talking. You're the only Whitman they'll follow now." She didn't mean it to sound grand, but it landed heavy in my chest. For the first time in weeks, the air inside the diner didn't feel stale. It felt alive. By 8, the booths were full. Not just with regulars, but neighbors I hadn't seen in months, people who usually drifted between chain restaurants and gas station coffee. They came back with cash in hand, ordering pie slices they didn't even finish. Some hugged me, some just nodded. But their message was the same: "We see you. We're with you." Meanwhile, my children stayed away. For a while. The first crack showed with Noah. A teller from the bank came by for lunch on Wednesday. She leaned over the counter, voice low. "Your son's been getting heat at the branch. Folks don't like the idea of him pushing his own mama out. Reputation sticks in a town like this." I nodded, poured her more coffee, and said nothing. Vanessa's fall was quieter, but sharper. She worked at the hospital administration office. By Friday, a nurse who came in for pie let it slip that donors were whispering, asking why someone trying to evict her mother should be handling charity funds. Her name was being tossed around in boardrooms, not with admiration, but suspicion. And Luke, my quiet boy, he showed up late one night, parked outside in his pickup with the headlights off. I watched him from the window as he sat there, engine idling, cigarette glowing faint red. He didn't come in, didn't knock, just drove away after 10 minutes. Regret has a way of sticking to some folks like tar. I wish I could say I felt joy at their downfall. But the truth, what I felt was tired. Betrayal ages you fast, and watching your own blood stumble under the weight of their choices. It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like a wound that won't close. Still, I didn't let it stop me. Instead of gloating, I rebuilt, quietly. First, I called the Historical Society, set up an appointment, took that old letter Frank filed, and pushed it through until it became official. Within 3 weeks, the Whitman Diner was fully registered as a local heritage site. The certificate came in a thick envelope embossed with a gold seal. I hung it on the wall right above the cash register, where everyone could see. That certificate became more than paper. It was a shield, a promise. Then, with Clara's help, I brought in 2 high school kids to train as servers. Gave them shifts after school, let them earn tips, showed them how to balance trays and wipe down counters. Watching their nervous hands steady, hearing their laughter fill the empty kitchen, it reminded me why the diner mattered in the first place. Not money, not legacy, people. The diner became busier. Not just with orders, but with energy. The kind that spreads through a town when someone refuses to be erased. Of course, my children didn't disappear. One Sunday after church, Vanessa cornered me in the parking lot. Her hair was perfect, her smile tight. "Mama," she said, her voice straining for calm, "don't you think this has gone far enough? People are starting to talk. You're hurting the family name." I looked her straight in the eye. "You did that yourself." Then I walked away. No yelling, no drama, just truth. A week later, Noah showed up at the diner, suit and tie, like he could argue me into submission. He leaned over the counter, hissed under his breath, "You think this town is really on your side? They'll turn." I poured him a cup of coffee, slid it toward him. "Then let's see," I said. "Drink up." He didn't. He left without finishing his sentence. As for Luke, he never spoke. But he kept showing up late at night, parking near the diner, watching from the shadows. Maybe he wanted forgiveness. Maybe he wanted courage. I don't know. But I stopped waiting for either, because something else was happening. Something bigger. The diner wasn't just surviving, it was transforming. On Thursdays, local veterans started gathering at the corner booth. On Saturdays, families who hadn't sat down together in years came back for pancakes. And one evening, Pastor Jim stood up mid-meal and declared the diner a sanctuary of truth. Folks laughed, but I saw tears in his eyes. It wasn't just food anymore. It was testimony. The night I hung the heritage certificate, I stayed late after closing. Alone. I wiped down each booth, polished the counter, and finally turned toward the wall where the gold seal gleamed under the light. I touched it just once with the tips of my fingers. "This place is safe now," I whispered. "Frank, I kept it." The tears came then hot and heavy. Not out of weakness, but release. Because for the first time since that folder hit my dining table, I felt control. But here's the thing about peace, it's fragile. I thought that certificate, that moment in the church hall, would be the end. But for my children, it was only the beginning. They weren't done scheming. And deep down, I knew the storm wasn't over. Not yet. That was the fallout, the cracks in their armor, the small steps I took to rebuild what they tried to bury. But friend, the reckoning, that was still waiting around the corner. Stick with me, because in the next part, you'll see how boundaries turned into a legacy, and how sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't loud, it's quiet, permanent, and undeniable. And tell me this, if someone tried to erase your life's work, what would you do? Leave me a comment. I want to hear your truth. Peace doesn't come all at once. It doesn't knock on your door with a ribbon and a bow. It arrives slowly, like steam curling from a coffee mug at dawn, like the flicker of a neon sign, finally humming steady after years of sputtering. That's how I knew I'd crossed over. Not when the papers were signed and sealed, not when the town rallied behind me, and not even when my children's schemes fell apart. No. The moment I knew I had made it was smaller than that. It was a Tuesday morning in early spring. I unlocked the diner at 6 sharp, same as I'd done for decades. The air still carried the bite of winter, but there was a softness to it, like the land itself was loosening its grip. I flipped on the lights, set the coffee to brew, and stood behind the counter listening to the percolator gurgle to life. And for the first time in months, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. Afraid of what they'd take from me. Afraid of waking up to find everything I'd built erased. Afraid of being made small in my own home. That fear was gone. The diner was full again by 8. Truckers drifting in off the interstate. Teenagers grabbing pancakes before school. Families that hadn't sat down together in years sliding into booths ordering stacks of biscuits just for the comfort of it. And veterans, always the veterans, claiming their corner booth on Thursdays, like it was holy ground. It wasn't just food anymore. It was belonging. And me, I stopped measuring my life in what I'd lost. I started measuring it in what I was giving. The fallout for my children came quick. Noah left town before summer. His name at the bank was poison, and he knew it. Last I heard, he was working in another county, nothing flashy, just a paycheck. For a boy who once strutted like he owned the world, that was a steep fall. Vanessa stayed local, but she shrank in every room she entered. Folks who once admired her polish now looked at her with suspicion. Even at church, her smile felt thinner forced, as if everyone saw through the gloss. And Luke, well, he never could find the words. I'd see his truck pass the diner at night, headlights dim, engine idling just long enough to make me wonder if he'd come in. But he never did. Regret is heavy, and some men don't have the strength to carry it out loud. I didn't chase them. I didn't slam doors in their faces either. I just let the distance settle where it belonged. Because love might stretch far, but trust. Once it snaps, it never fits the same way again. Instead, I poured myself into the diner and into something bigger. Remember that old tape Frank made his voice steady, saying the diner would always be mine? I couldn't get it out of my head. He believed in me long before anyone else did. So I decided to honor him in the only way I knew how. I started the Whitman Scholarship Fund. 1 scholarship a year paid straight from diner profits for a local student, especially daughters of veterans wanting to study culinary arts or small business. Something to keep the chain of resilience alive. The first recipient was a girl named Emily, 17, shy as a fawn. Her father served in the Gulf. Her mother cleaned houses to make ends meet. She cried when I handed her the acceptance letter across the counter. Said no one had ever believed in her before. I told her, then you start here. Let this be proof. Seeing her shoulders straighten, her eyes shine, that was legacy. Not money, not ownership papers, not even the diner sign glowing above Main Street. Legacy was planting a seed in someone who needed it most. The town noticed. The diner wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It became a landmark, a kind of gathering place for truth. Kids worked their first jobs there. Veterans leaned on each other there, and lonely souls found pie slices waiting for them like lifelines. One night, Pastor Jim stood in the doorway and declared, "This diner is more than food. It's a testimony." Folks laughed, but I saw tears in his eyes, and I knew exactly what he meant. Because in saving the diner, I hadn't just preserved a building. I'd reclaimed my right to exist on my own terms. Of course, some nights were still hard. Nights when I'd catch myself staring at the road, wondering if Luke would ever stop driving circles around his guilt. Nights when I remembered the sting of Vanessa's words, the cold efficiency of Noah's hands pushing that folder across the table. Betrayal doesn't fade overnight. It lingers sharp and sour like old coffee grounds. But peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of boundaries. I learned that forgiveness doesn't always mean letting people back in. Sometimes it just means letting go without reopening the door. My children will always be mine by blood, but my story, that belongs to me. One evening, months later, the diner sign flickered. For years, it had been half dead, buzzing weekly letters, sputtering in the dark. But that night, every bulb lit up at once, steady, bright whole. I stood on the sidewalk apron, still dusted with flour, and watched the glow spread across Main Street. Neighbors stopped, clapped, cheered like it was fireworks on the 4th of July. But I didn't clap. I just smiled, because that light wasn't just a sign. It was survival. It was truth. It was proof that silence could end. Sometimes I think about legacy, not the kind carved on tombstones or hidden in bank accounts, but the legacy that lives in the way people remember you after you've walked out of the room. Did you stand? Did you endure? Did you lead with dignity, even when the knives came from your own blood? I hope that's what folks remember about me. Not the betrayal, not the paperwork, but the refusal to fold. So if you're listening to me now, maybe from your kitchen table, maybe in your car parked under a lonely streetlight, I want you to hear this. If someone tries to erase you, you do not disappear. If they try to write you off, you pick up the pen and write your own ending. Because legacy isn't what they give you. It's what you leave behind in spite of them. I left behind more than a diner. I left behind a light on Main Street, a scholarship fund with my husband's name on it, and a town that knows I didn't surrender. And that, my friend, is the story. Not of revenge shouted loud, but of peace earned. A quiet peace that comes when you draw a line no one can cross again. Now tell me, has anyone ever tried to write you out of your own story? And what boundaries did you set that saved you? I'd love to hear, because sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we share out loud.